I want to welcome everyone to this panel on Israeli leadership. Welcome our panelists, Gil Troy, Nachman Shai, and Rachel Fish. My first question is a very basic one, and it's, who is an Israeli leader, past or present, that you hold in high regard, and why? Rachel, why don't we start with you?
An Israeli leader that I would be interested in highlighting is David Ben-Gurion. And David Ben-Gurion, I think, for me, is the epitome of what it really means to be able to find ability to come to pieces of compromise or a consensual position, knowing that you need to bring everyone along, and that most people aren't going to be happy with any decision you make. But he did this because he had a bigger imagination for what the collective could achieve and for what Israel could become as the nation state of the Jewish people and a laboratory for the Jewish people, knowing that what the religious and what the secular and the revisionists and the spiritual cultural Zionists all wanted weren't always aligned with one another. And I really think about the decision he made around the Altalena affair as one of the most crucial decisions in terms of what it means to build the state and what it means to have one individual take full responsibility for the creation of the nation state and this idea of mamlachtiyut, statism, and putting the state and the collective before individual needs. So I would put my chip in there for David Ben-Gurion to start off the conversation.
A great place to start. Gil, how about you?
So it's very funny because I grew up in a home. We were growing up in New York in the 1960s and 70s. And David Ben-Gurion's name was Mud because my father was a Beitari. I have to say, over the years, I've really come to appreciate David Ben-Gurion more and more, and even the decision about the Altalena. But the person I have to nominate as my exemplary Israeli leader precisely at that moment is Menachem Begin. Because here you have a very strong patriot. Here you have someone who has a real appreciation for Jewish history, the power of the moment in 1948, when finally we have, as he says, Hebrew power and Hebrew rule, after the Jew had become the symbol of the sniveling, cowardly, lost soul. Begin, Jabotinsky, and Ben-Gurion all understood that part of the power of the Zionist revolution wasn't just changing regimes. The American Revolution had to get rid of the British. The French Revolution had to get rid of the French king. The Russian Revolution had to get rid of the Tsar. But the Zionist revolution also had to get rid of that broken down inner Yid. And Begin himself, who was such a bizarre mix, he was very bookish, he was a lawyer, he was an intellectual, and yet to so many of his followers, especially after his 29 years in opposition, when he became prime minister, he looked like the most sabra of sabras, despite his accent, despite his Europeanism. Understood that power. And on that difficult day, when he is on the Altalena, when he, by his interpretation, had reached out to Ben-Gurion, we can debate the details. But the fact that he chose not to call for civil war, the fact that so many of his people were saying, look, Jew firing on Jew after the Shoah, Jew firing on Jew, is this what the Hebrew Revolution that you're talking about is all about? And the fact that he led his people at that moment, that difficult moment, at that heartbreaking moment, to unity and accepted the man whom he really detested, Ben-Gurion, as the ultimate leader, is a remarkable moment in history. And the fact that 29 years later he was able to become prime minister is a whole other series of model moments of leadership which we can talk about. So over the years, whereas once upon a time it was Begin in the white hat and Ben-Gurion in the black hat, I think both of them have somewhat gray hats, and actually take off my hat, mon chapeau, both to David Ben-Gurion, because I understand the need to create an IDF, an Israel Defense Forces that's united, have united command. And I also understand that Begin, playing his role in that historic tragedy, understood this is the time, to give up and to understand that there were greater issues involved in Jewish history, in Israeli history, in Zionism at that moment.
Thank you. Nachman, you bring a different perspective as somebody who served directly with many Israeli leaders. Who would you put forward?
Actually, I had both names in front of me, but I choose Yitzhak Rabin, not only because I had the honor of working for him for a few years, but and I knew him pretty well. And I also, as a reporter, covered him as a prime minister and so on. It's a different generation of Israeli leaders. No doubt Begin and Ben-Gurion will be always on the front line, but Rabin will be, historically, Rabin will be there as well. And if you read his life's story, it's the story of the state of Israel from almost day one. He was there all the way in the pre-state days, and then after, he was the chief of the general staff, the 6-Day War, Jerusalem, territories, Judea and Samaria, and then he was ambassador in Washington, and he knew how to combine between diplomacy and military or defense affairs. And then later on, he became a politician and prime minister. And what I remember vividly is Rabin's resignation, doing something that there is a word for it in English, but not in Hebrew. It's accountability. He took responsibility for his wife's decision to keep now it sounds ridiculous, a bank account in Washington, and which was illegal at the time in Israel. And he resigned. He resigned because of that. And all the audience here can compare between then and now and what happened or did not happen in Israel since then. Rabin resigned. And then he came back. He came back and then it was the time I worked for him. And it was a different Rabin. It was a different person. And he learned the lessons. And then he became prime minister. And as prime minister, he signed the Oslo Accords, which, if you read all his life story, it was against his own beliefs, against his own perception of what it means Israel's security. But he figured out it's time for peace. And then he was assassinated. And his assassination was not only kind of a personal one. We didn't only lose him, but with him, we lost the peace. The word peace is not mentioned any longer in the public sphere in Israel since Rabin disappeared. And I think this is the story of Israel. And if you just reread Israel history and reread Rabin's history, and you compare with them, you see how it went from one point to another. So I miss him very much.
Thank you all for sharing. So I wrote down a few traits that you guys mentioned. Rachel talked about compromise, building consensus. Gil talked about the concept of strength and power, but also restraint at the same time, and changing imagery. Nachman, you talked about changing with time, learning from mistakes, being diplomatic, having accountability. Are there traits that Israeli leaders must have that is unique to Israel? And Gil, you're a historian of American history, so I'd love to start with you as somebody who's studied both arenas. But are there things that are unique that Israeli leaders need to be successful that maybe other leaders don't?
It's a great question. I'll answer it in some ways in the negative and then I'll go to the positive. American leaders, traditional American leaders, we're going to put the current president aside. We're not going to get into partisanship. But traditionally, especially in the post-Franklin Roosevelt era, the power of the presidency, Richard Neustadt, the political scientist, famously said, is the power to persuade. And the power of the presidency is very much based on the public speech. And if you think about it, many of the greatest moments, Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, or calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, John Kennedy's famous inaugural address, Barack Obama, both before the White House and while in the White House. It's these kind of moments. Israeli history is less about what we might call that showmanship. And I actually think that showmanship is important. I'm not disrespecting it. So that's actually something that's missing. And one of my frustrations over the years watching Israeli leaders is they don't have that ability, and there isn't that same value of bringing people together through that speech. I mean, there have been certain famous speeches in Israeli history, but it's not the same kind of thing. It's not the same kind of ritualistic power that you have with the presidency. But two things I'd like to focus on that an Israeli leader definitely needs to have, and I just touched on a little bit with Begin, is one, that real sense of Jewish history, of Jewish commitment, not just Israeli history and Israeli commitment. Aleph Bet Yehoshua, the famous writer, very much from the left, says, what is a Zionist? A Zionist is someone who understands that we need Israel to be both a state for all its citizens, but also that it is a state that belongs to the Jewish people. And it's very important for me that every Israeli leader, first of all, understand that he or she is a prince or princess of the Jewish people. And we talked about Begin and Ben-Gurion, both these people who, you put them in a room, A, there was tremendous intellectual firepower, but B, there was a lot of, hatred. But men of morality. Go to Sde Boker, the kibbutz where where Ben-Gurion retired to. Go to the Begin Center, and you see the salon, the living room that Menachem Begin lived in. These men were men of modesty, of humility, because they understood, and I think was part of their Jewishness. It was understanding that they are leaders of the Jewish people, and that it's not for them to have fancy houses and to live off the state. They live for the state. So the one dimension is a kind of humility because of the grandeur, the greatness of Jewish history. The second dimension within that Jewish peoplehood dimension is understanding that you're not just speaking to the people of Israel, but you're also speaking to the Jewish people. And the third is not just counting in the moment. The great modern failure is too many of our leaders are playing to the poll, are playing to the election, are playing to the moment. And you've got to be living in history. And one of the things that's so exciting about Jewish history is we're not just counting in decades, as I do as an American historian. I write books about the 80s and the 90s and the thousands. But when you're talking about Jewish history, you're not just even talking about the centuries, you're talking about the millennia. And so that's something that's often missing. And then the other thing is just, as was mentioned, sometimes you just got to be decisive. And there's less margin of error in Israel. And there's sometimes a need more for just quick blitzkrieg leadership.
Nachman, I'm curious to pick up on what Gil was talking about in terms of not just speaking to the people of Israel, but speaking to the Jewish people. Obviously, your career was focused on communication. And so how would you look at these traits? What do you think is necessary for the unique climate of Israel in leadership?
First of all, Gil is absolutely right. We have been discussing that a lot in decision-making process in the government level and in other levels, even the Shabak or the Mossad or even the IDF, when they make decisions about what to do in this issue, on that issue, on another, even operational decisions to take certain operation against Israel's enemies, there's always a question: what will it do to the people in the diaspora, the Jews in the diaspora? It's there. It's one of their considerations. They know the link, which now Rachel is partly in charge of, between what Israel has been doing and anti-Semitism. And what will happen to Jews somewhere in the world when Israel launches an operation against terrorists in Lebanon, or in Libya, or in Syria, or in Iran, or wherever? What will it do to Jews? This is something very unique. I don't think the Prime Minister of Italy or the President of France have ever thought about that, what it will do to French, to Italians living out of the country when they do something as Prime Minister or heads of states. So that's very Jewish. So they are not only the Prime Minister of Israel, in a way, they are also leading the Jewish people. That's heavy responsibility, much heavier than any other head of state that I know of. Anyhow, by the way, we have like 9 million prime ministers in Israel, as you know, because every Israeli is a kind of prime minister. So everyone will more or less feel the same. I mean, we are not only responsible for our destiny, but for Jews living out of the country. But then I would like to say something else. There is an expression in Hebrew, and all the Israeli Hebrew-speaking participants will know what I mean. דברים שרואים מכאן לא רואים משם, which means things that you see from here, you don't see from there, and vice versa. And most of Israel prime ministers, not all of them, but even those first, I mean, the two mentioned by Rachel and Gil, Begin and Ben-Gurion, both when they came to power, saw things differently than before. They made historic compromises. Ben-Gurion, from the very fact of establish the state of Israel, even in a very small territory, but at least to have a state. And Begin, I mean, what else he can do? He was the first prime minister which ordered to evacuate Jews from territories. What else can you expect a prime minister of Israel to do? And then it's true about Sharon, and about Olmert, and about Rabin, which I mentioned before. So this kind of, I wouldn't say flexibility, you can call it, or otherwise, but you see things differently when you sit at the prime minister office in Jerusalem than when you were head of opposition or you fulfilled any other role in the public service. Now you see things differently and you are allowed to behave differently. That's the qualities or the traits I see in Israeli prime minister.
Rachel, I'm curious if you'd like to comment either on the work you're doing now in terms of anti-Semitism and how that crosses over into leadership, or this conversation of being a leader of the Jewish people, not just a leader of Israel. And by the way, a lot of the focus so far have been on the Rosh HaMemshalah, the prime minister. But there are many others who serve in leadership roles within Israel, both past and present. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on some of these traits and what you think is needed to be successful.
Yes, thank you, Rich. I appreciate Gil and Nachman's perspectives. And Nachman, I think you're spot on to recognize the unique position in terms of representing your citizens, but then also this diaspora community that spans a variety of countries, leaders, policies, and also different forms of the way anti-Semitism manifests itself. One of the things I'm thinking about as a historian when we talk about this, and I'm looking also at one of the comments that's made in this chat, which is around the David Ben-Gurion, Jacob Blaustein agreement. Because for the American Jewish community in particular, there was a very strong sense in that early period of the state's formation that the American Jewish communal leadership was hesitant to have the prime minister of the state represent Jews writ large, and said, you can't control or tell us what to do because we're not citizens. And there's always been this, I'd say, healthy tension in many ways between specifically the American Jewish community and Israel in terms of its leadership and decision-making, because American Jews said, we actually want to try to be American. So Ben-Gurion and others don't come here and try to encourage Aliyah, because it's a different thing than being in South America. It's a different thing than being in Russia. It's a different thing than being in other parts of Europe. And so there has been this tension for quite a long time. I would also add to that the American Jewish community still struggles with what does it mean when the prime minister speaks on behalf of Jews. And we saw that several times now with Prime Minister Netanyahu, where there was a sense from many American Jewish leaders and also American Jews who felt like this actually doesn't represent many of the American Jewish mainstream perspectives. So there is this tension, and I think it's worthy of note, but Nachman, I 100% agree with you that when the prime minister decides to do something, it absolutely has a ripple effect beyond the green line and for Jews who are anywhere, and we know this. And we also know that thank goodness there is a nation state for Jews, because when Jews are experiencing an increase in anti-Semitism, and not only for that reason, but for sure we see that, they know that they have a safe haven that they can go to, which they didn't before the existence of the state of Israel. I would just add one more piece to this, Rich, and I don't know, Gil, if it's unique to Israeli leadership, but I do think of Michael Waltzer's idea of being a connected critic and thinking about the prophets. And he talks about the prophets as connected critics. When Michael Waltzer is doing that, he sees the prophets as these individuals who are deeply rooted within their Jewishness and their morality based upon particularism and universalism, and the responsibility they have while also remaining connected in the process of their criticism. It's constructive criticism. And when I think of Israeli leaders, and I think, for example, of one of the high-ranking IDF officials a few years ago who used his opportunity during a Yad Vashem ceremony for Yom HaShoah VaHaZikaron, in which, he used his platform to criticize what Israeli society and government and policies were happening, but he did so from a place of being deeply connected within the state and feeling a deep connection to the Jewish collective.
It was Yair Golan. He was a general, and is now a Knesset member from the left.
And also someone like David Grossman, who's not in the Knesset, right? But who absolutely, when he speaks and when he writes, you feel that connection, and it's not a disillusionment. It's not an abandonment. It's not walking away, but it's a place of saying we have to do better. And so I do think there's a piece of that. And Gil, it may not be unique to Israel, but I think it's very important to Israeli leadership.
But it's a great segue to my next question, Rachel, and I'll start with you since you took us there. You just talked about that sort of model and lesson that we can learn from these moments of disagreement. So how can educators use these lessons of leadership in the classroom to teach Israel's story, to use it to teach Jewish values, civic values, participation in Jewish life?
Look, I think as an Israel educator, one of the key components in teaching the complexity of Israeli society is that it's complex. There's no black and white, and that all of the educators who are participating today, the way I understand their job and the way I've approached my job in this realm is that I need to get students in that gray mud of complexity and have them really struggle through it and encourage them to end their sentences with question marks rather than exclamation points. So even just a simple exercise as trying to understand, and I'm thinking now of when I sit in Stay Boker with students that I've taken, whether it's faculty or young people, and have them walk through some of the points of decision-making that David Ben-Gurion had to make, whether it was about accepting reparations from Germany, and which not everyone wanted him to accept, or whether it's who decided that it was okay to sign the declaration and who didn't want to sign that declaration. What was the debate around Sur Yisrael versus not having a name of God in there, right? All of these very complex pieces, let alone security matters. And so I think you can look at these leaders and put them in their historical context and recognize that no decision is pure. Right? No decision is pure, and each comes with real critical analysis and recognizing that there are multiple aspects that will be impacted, whether it is the people themselves, whether it's about the Arabs surrounding them, whether it's Palestinians within the borders, whether it's about the Jewish communities in diaspora, and so many other. So I think there are opportunities to use these individuals and also to recognize that there's also a recognition of who wasn't part of those conversations, right? And to understand who wasn't at the table and to try to bring those voices in as well, whether it's women voices, Mizrahi, which now there are more of, whether it's religious voices, which now more of those voices are in. But they weren't always part of the canon in many ways. And Gil has written one of those canons in some ways. And so he knows it's been tricky to sometimes find the other folks who can contribute to that conversation.
Gil, how about you? What do you recommend to our Israel educators, for how they can use some of these lessons of leadership?
Allow me to express one of my frustrations about one of the bees in my bonnet. When we were living in Montreal, we lived in a lovely suburb called Westmount. And every Friday afternoon, we went to the beautiful Shar Shemayim, where they had the Jewish day school, and we would hear Shabbat stories. And what were the stories we heard? It was raining and snowing and miserable in Minsk and Pinsk, and the Jews were suffering and were oppressed, and they didn't have enough food, and it was cold. And I'm thinking, they're living in suburban paradise. And all we do is tell them these stories about Eastern European suffering and misery. How are these kids going to relate? And when we talk about some of the decisions that Rachel and Nachman have been zeroing in on, we have an opportunity for Jewish kids of all levels, be they, for children's stories or for sophisticated high school texts, to zero in on those decisions. Let me just give you a few. Indeed, David Ben-Gurion, when he basically decides that it's time, okay, May 14th, 1948, let's raise that flag, let's take that decision to make the Declaration of Independence. And Chaim Weizmann says, what were they waiting for, the idiots? Because there's been a big debate, and he did the right thing. Ovadia Yosef is living in Tel Aviv, and it's very important for him as a leading, he's not yet, the superstar that he became, this is when he's much younger, with a family, and he is in Tel Aviv, and he's growing in prominence as a rabbi. And the mayor comes to him and says, there's a lot of traffic on your street because he's living in a neighborhood which has datim and chilonim. We want to block the traffic. Should he do that or should he not? And Ovadia Yosef looks at him and says, I never hear any traffic. I don't know what you're talking about. And that was his way of saying, I want to live with one another. Natan Sharansky, Avital Sharansky, they get married and they've been married for a day, and Avital Sharansky is offered a visa in Russia. Should she take it or should she not take it? Natan Sharansky is sitting in the gulag, and he's finally offered an opportunity to get out on health grounds. Should he take it or not take it? And he says, well, if I get out on health grounds, that will make the Soviet Union look humanitarian, and he suffers in jail for 2 more years. These kind of unbelievable goosebump decisions, which can be really amazing children's stories, but also can be deep dives into the complexity, the diversity, the richness of Jewish history, of Israeli history, of Zionist history, and simply of humanity. And we miss so much because the other bee in my bonnet I'll throw out is, how do we tell the history of Israel? 48, 56, 67, hike, right? that it's just the wars. And I, as an American historian who teach by the decades, want us to start teaching Israeli history by the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, bring in some of the economic dimensions, the social dimensions, the cultural dimensions. Yossi Klein Halevi did so brilliantly in his book, Like Dreamers. Make it three-dimensional. Because when it's just about Israel and Palestinians, we lose. When it's more about life and the reality, the real Israel that we live and love, whether we live here or not, then it works. And then it's about our identity.
Nachman, I'm going to pivot the question a little bit differently for you because unlike our other panelists, and I believe every one of our participants, you actually served in the Knesset as a member of Knesset. You were an Israeli leader, and you worked and integrated on a daily basis with leaders, both from the political realm and the military realm, as well as other segments of Israeli society. So having this sort of bird's eye view of what it means to be an Israeli leader, what advice would you give to our educators here for teaching that sense of Israeli leadership to help teach the story?
It's a tough question. Yes, I did work with some of them. And as I said before, I miss them as well. And I miss not only Rabin, I miss Moshe Arens, whom I liked very much. And I had the pleasure of working with him in different capacities in Washington at the embassy, and then as a defense minister, and then later on. And was a great man. And somehow he was missed, I would say, by many that didn't know him quite well. And he could have been even prime minister, but he just didn't want to. I want to follow up with what Gil said, and I like very much that Israel is not only about wars. It's about nation building. I don't know how many of our workshop participants have ever thought about Levi Eshkol. Levi Eshkol, a name that most of us don't even remember. And he was really a builder of the state of Israel. One of the builders, maybe the builder. But beyond the scenes, you didn't know about him, you don't remember him. He was Israel's prime minister in the Six-Day War. And he was forced out of office as a defense minister because of a certain popular movement, which was initiated by Shimon Peres and Moshe Dayan at the time, some few demonstrations, and a terrible speech that he made once, and it will always be learned in Israel history at the eve of the Six-Day War. He couldn't pronounce some words, something very ridiculous in a historic perspective. And he was the one who built Israel's defense forces to the Six-Day War. He was the one, no one else. But he was forced out of office. Dayan took over and got all the credit for the Six-Day War. And Eshkol was there. If you read his life story, he was there from the beginning of the 19th century, all over. And he was 11 years finance minister. He built Israel during the recession, during terrible times. He saved Israel economically. And he was quite a nice Jew, you know, with a Jewish sense of humor, and he disappeared. So Gil spoke about other perspective of Israel. I can give you a list of war heroes. One of them is Dado Elazar, the chief of staff in the 1973 war. Again, he was kicked out of office sometime after the war. And now when we look backward, we know it was a grave mistake. He was not responsible for Israel's failure in the Yom Kippur War. It's just the opposite. He saved Israel in the Yom Kippur War. But Moshe Dayan was there to do things in his own way, and Dado paid the price. So I would like, if I may suggest, to look a little bit deeper into Israeli history and to find names and heroes that are not usually being mentioned. And that's a tough role, I know. It's much easier to go to the first line, like Golda and Sharon, and even Netanyahu, and I have nothing against Netanyahu. But they are all there. But I would say try to pick up names that are not usually in the news or were in the news, but had a major role in the nation building of Israel, which is, in my view, one of the greatest miracles of the 20th century.
So that's a great pivot. Rachel, are there leaders that you feel are overlooked and that could really, if educators do more about them, could enhance our teaching of Israel education?
I mean, of course. And again, I would go to some of those voices that a lot of students don't know. And maybe it's because these individuals were on the margins of major decisions, or because their ideas or views didn't win at the end of the day. But people like Henrietta Sold, right, who had a profound impact on Zionist thought, Zionist ideas. she was in favor of binationalism at the end of the day. Politically, not going to succeed in the way she imagined, but in terms of the work that she did for society and social welfare, unbelievable. And there is a history in terms of Hadassah Hospital and here in America with the American Jewish women who have been involved. But younger generations, I really don't think, know the complexity of Henrietta Szold herself. And so there's an opportunity, for example, to delve deeper. It's funny, when I was a little kid, I remember reading Golda Meir's biography, and autobiography, and thinking about how incredible this immigrant was, Jewish from Russia, then American, and then becomes Israeli and a leader in politics. And then you actually learn some of the politics and you cringe a little bit because it's not the myth that is painted in some of the American Jewish educational spheres, but they absolutely need to be uncovered and unearthed in order for our students to engage again in more complexity. And also, I think out of the realm of politics, we need to think as well, right? It shouldn't just be looking at military and political figures. There are really incredible thinkers who have been involved in all aspects of, again, thinking about particularism and universalism, and how to bridge those two worlds on a regular basis that opens up opportunities for our students. I mean, when I think about ways in which I engage students, I think about what does it mean for Israel to be a laboratory for the Jewish people and simultaneously be Jewish and democratic. And that's challenging. That is a good challenge for our students, and one also that allows them to recognize that the project isn't over. It isn't sealed. There's a lot that can still be uncovered, and also that they themselves should see themselves as part of that story and that they have a role in it.
Gail, how about you? Who's an overlooked figure that you think could really add more substance to our Israel education?
So I agree with Rachel that in some ways we've been focusing too much on political leaders, and we should think of scientists like Ada Yonat and Ruth Arnone, who invented one of the most powerful drugs against MS. Poets like Erez Biton, to also bring in more of a Mizrahi voice. But the person I want to be subversive, having pushed Menachem Begin, one person I think would be a fascinating role model and worthy really of studying in so many different ways is Shulamit Aloni, because we tend to think of leaders only working off the power of their position. And one of the things that Shulamit Aloni was very effective was doing was showing the power of being in opposition. First of all, she, tough lady. Paul Machniki was imprisoned by the Jordanians in the wake of the 48 war, lawyer, feminist, had a famous clash with Golda Meir, where Golda Meir looked at her and said, in the Labor Party, we don't say I, we only say us. And she can help us understand the transition that the Labor Party goes through from being the party for decades to being a party of opposition, but even more than that, from being the party of us and the party of socialism and the party of Ben-Gurion and Golda to the party of human rights and the party of I and the party of a more personal kind of approach to civil liberties. And so in this one woman's life, with all the frustrating positions and all the different ways in which I disagree with her, which I think is also healthy to model. She's an excellent way into the question of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. She's an excellent way into a question of feminism, of Oslo and Palestinians, of the rights of Israeli Arabs. And so I think you take someone like that who's a little subversive, who, yes, at moments, I'm sure Nachman could tell us, although you're probably too much of a gentleman, could be obnoxious. Not everybody's lovely to have dinner with, but she made history. She pushed things. She pushed Israel, and she helped invent modern Israel.
I think there are so many names. Privately, if I may say, Ken offered a line of names from all kinds of areas, and I feel frustrated that I cannot bring them and others up. I think that we are fortunate. We have quite a number of leaders, and not necessarily in politics or in military, but in other areas as well, in education. Where is Chaim Weizmann? Where is not all the Israeli presidents? I exclude some of them, and as well as prime ministers. But yeah, they are, and the worlds of literature and arts, we concentrate and focus just on political media. But I think that perfect example, Gil, about to remember Aloni and others. I mean, they introduced new values into Israeli society. Human rights were not common words when Shula only started to talk about them, and now this is a common word, and we understand even the vis-a-vis the relation between Jews and Arabs living in Israel. What do human rights mean for us and for them as well? But in the 60s and 70s, this was something totally new for Israel.
I think of someone, Nachman, when you talk about that, of someone like Lova Eliav, who was, at the forefront of a lot of these thinking and has often been lost and forgotten. My last question for the three of you has to do with a prominent book that came out this year. Dennis Ross and David Makovsky came out with a book that focused on the three people you all chose, plus Ariel Sharon at our beginning. And they chose a biblical verse, "Be strong and of good courage," as their title. And in choosing the title, they wrote that for them, this is the essence of what we think Israel's leaders will need to show as they face the future, particularly if they are to preserve Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. You've all touched on some of these tensions and challenges in your different remarks: diaspora versus Israel, Israel as a democracy, Israel as a Jewish state. So I'm curious what you think of their choice of the title and their assessment when it comes to this notion of what is needed for the next generation of Israeli leaders.
May I be so bold as to say a lack of ego? I'm not in Israel. I do not vote in Israel. So I don't want to presume that I should have any say in what the leadership of Israel should look like. But I do think throughout the world, many of us that are in democracies are seeking individuals who understand the need to lessen the divisiveness and lessen the political rhetoric and actually engage in trying to create the changes needed in order to make our societies more democratic and less fraying at the edges, maybe more than fraying at the edges. So be strong and be courageous. Yes. What leader doesn't need to be that, right? We all need leaders who understand when you need to be decisive and when you need to make difficult choices. And yes, Israel is often in a neighborhood that requires very precise decision-making because of the neighborhood. But I actually think it's more than just being strong and having the courage to be strong. I actually think it goes back to what Gil was saying, that this is part of an experiment of a millennium of Jewish sovereignty. And what does it mean when you can reimagine Jewish sovereignty and self-determination? And what does it mean when Zionism's goal was to create, to some degree, that self-determination? So what does it mean to have Zionism in the 21st century, especially when we say the project isn't over? So it's not enough just to have a state. And yes, we have this notion of a light unto the nations. So where are we like everyone else, and where does Israel need to be different? So yes, you need the grit and the courage and the strength, but I'd like to think you also can be more than that. Because what I fear is that if you're not open, if you're not looking for bridge building, if you're not building connections, and if you're not actually addressing the needs of your citizens, then you need to be able to pivot in order to retain both characteristics of particularism and universalism. And in this case, for me, that's Jewish and democratic. And for many of us who teach about Israel, I do think that many students will be pushing their educators about what does it mean if Israel is not democratic.
Rachel mentioned this idea of, what does Zionism look like moving forward? And Gil, it's obviously something that you've spent a lot of time writing about and thinking about. So either a comment on Rachel's comment or just about that notion of being strong and of good courage.
So I know this is a panel on leadership, and so we end up emphasizing so much top down. Mm-hmm. But the real Zionist challenge and the real challenge to making sure Israel is Jewish and democratic is not only on the shoulders of our leaders, but it's really on the citizenry. And we have a tendency sometimes to overemphasize the great leader, how this person or that person changes things. And one of the extraordinary things about Israeli society is its resilience. And I think we've seen this in the last couple of months for all the tragedy of COVID and for all the frustration, frankly, that so many people have with Bibi Netanyahu. During the moments of shutdown, there was a certain sense of the anachnu, of the collective. And obviously we're on a panel with Nachman Shai, who's one of the heroes in history, not only because of the leadership that he gave, but because of the interaction that you had with the people. And so I think we have a tendency sometimes to overemphasize the leaders. Another way we overemphasize the leaders, I'm finishing a book now that's coming out in September with Natan Sharansky. And this is one of his big obsessions, so it's become one of my big obsessions. It's what we call the if-onlyers. If only Rabin hadn't been assassinated, then we'd have peace. If only Sharon had not had the stroke, then Gaza wouldn't have been in the mess it was. If only, if only, if only. There's sometimes some truth to that, but sometimes we have a tendency to exaggerate. We miss the fact that Hamas and terrorism was starting before Rabin's assassination. We miss the fact that Hamas and terrorism was building up even when Sharon was disengaging. So we have to, focus on the people, and that's the real Zionist challenge. The real Zionist educational challenge to me is making sure that Zionism isn't just something in the history books, it isn't just something in the museums, but really is part of the day-to-day conversation. And that's why I've tried to have these Zionist salons, not only in the diaspora, but also in Israel, to really get people thinking about what does Zionism mean. And that's our real work. And if I can just take one more minute, we've been extremely polite and haven't mentioned the elephant in the room, which is Bibi Netanyahu. And I think as educators, it's very important, and I know we don't want to be partisan, but so let me give one way of thinking about it, that there really are three Bibis. Bibi number one is the Churchill Bibi, which is the Bibi that I read about when he writes books about the place among nations, and he writes about Churchillian leadership, and that's one form of Jewish leadership we have to understand that we sometimes see in him. The second is frankly stable Bibi. For all the frustrations that so many of us have, it was not only during COVID, but I know many of my friends, even from the left, say, I have a lot of criticisms about Bibi Netanyahu, but at the end of the day, during the various Gaza operations, he was cautious. He didn't jump the gun. Israel has had relative peace and prosperity during his period. There have been diplomatic achievements. Let's give him some credit and let's sift. And then the third Bibi is the Bibi who doesn't have the grace, the grandeur that Churchillian Bibi has, doesn't have the patience and the discipline that stable Bibi has, and unfortunately has brought us to a coarsening of Israeli society, has brought out much of the ugliness in Israeli society. And to contradict myself a little bit, I'm sorry to say that we see both in the American society and Israeli society that while it really is dependent on the people, the leader can bring out the better angels in our nature, as Abraham Lincoln said, and he can also bring out sometimes the beast and the demons in us, left and right, whether he or she is from the left or the right.
Nachman, how about you? Any comments on this sense of being strong and of good courage?
The journey, I would say in general, is not over. Moses didn't bring us to the promised land. Someone else did. But it seems like even while we are in the promised land, the journey continues. And every Israeli should see himself or herself as Moses, that he has to lead 12 tribes. We have more or less 12 tribes even now in Israel. The country is very divided. To bring them all together, to unite them, and to lead them towards a common goal. It's not Israel of the 50s or the 40s or even the 60s. The country is divided. Solidarity, yes, it was shown during some time, the beginning of the coronavirus, no longer. Everyone fights for himself and herself to survive now economically. And the country in general, that's another qualification, of course, and it's also in the book you mentioned, is that you have to be aware of a constant danger to the very existence of the state of Israel. It's always there. North, south, east, somewhere. It's always there. And every decision you make should bear in mind that it has implications of Israel's survival. Yet, you have to be aware of the precious of human life. Make sure that human life will be number one on your agenda. Make sure you don't, and that's why I like very much what you said, Gil, about Bibi. I have a lot of criticism about him, and I miss another Bibi that you probably didn't know, Bibi of the early 80s at the Washington in Washington. This was a different person. I don't sometimes know whether I met the right person. I met him in the 70s, actually. I went to school with his brother, and I know him pretty well. I miss that Bibi. And I have a lot of things to say about today's Bibi. And one of them is modesty. Bibi forgot what it means to be modest, to understand the limits of his position, not the power, the limits. Always remember that you are in a room. And you are in a room. This is the room, just a room, but there are ceiling and floor, and you can't do anything you want, even if you are the Prime Minister of Israel. Just the opposite, because you are the Prime Minister of Israel. So every Israeli leader should be, first of all, modest, and secondly, courageous. Yes, he has to be, because at the end of the day, that's what I heard from many of them, you are alone. You have to make the decisions by yourself. If these are the right decisions, you will have many partners tomorrow morning. If it was the wrong one, if it went wrong, you'll be on your own and you face history, and especially Jewish history.
Michal, who's from Kansas City, specifically says that, Nachman, you spoke about Israeli leadership needing to consider diaspora Jewry's perspective before acting. Do you see any increasing resistance to this idea in Israeli society, especially as the perspectives of Israeli Jewry and diaspora Jewry diverge? Is it time to jettison this consideration? Should Israeli leaders still be taking the diaspora into consideration?
Yes, it should be always on their agenda, on the table, whatever decision is being made, on military decisions, diplomatic decisions, everywhere. It should be on Israel. The point is, and Michal is right, things have changed in Israel. We deal with a new generation of Israeli leaders that were not born in the diaspora and was not raised in the diaspora and don't sometimes understand what the diaspora is, and especially American Jewry. Rachel rightly said there are Jews all around the world and there are American Jewry, and they're not exactly the same. And we used to take groups, I used to take groups of Knesset members and bringing them to this country, visiting Jewish federations to get some idea what Jewish life in this country means, because they had no idea. And now some of them are in the level of government ministers. And I assure you, when they came to this country 3-4 years ago, they didn't know what American Jewry is. So we have to go through a certain new paradigm, what I call, which means that Israel has to give much more than it gets, much more than it gets. And you are doing that job right now in the United States when you teach about Israel and the story of Israel. But I believe that every Israeli leader should bear in mind that Jews live in the diaspora, in over 100 states, small, big communities, and every decision, everything which is being done in Israel will have implications on their life. It should be the case. And even if most of the Israeli public are not aware of it, but the leaders of Israel should be aware of it.
Another question comes from Jonathan Golden from Boston. He says, what do you guys think about how leaders in leadership are taught in Israel education today? Are the leaders given the most attention from politics and the military, or other fields as well? Gil, how about you? What do you see about the way that we're teaching Israeli leadership? What's the tachlis we can give to our educators in terms of assessing the state of teaching leadership?
At the risk of being self-promoting, one of the things I tried to do with the Zionist ideas was precisely that, was to bring the different voices to the table, left, right, religious, non-religious, women, Mizrahim, who weren't just political leaders. I mean, obviously Rabin appears and Begin appears and Shlomo Aloni appears, but there are other non-political leaders. But more than that, I also launched a whole series of what I call Zionist salons. And I said it was the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel. I say if we have 70 conversations about Zionism, about the ideas behind it, and about the culture and the peoplehood and what it means to us personally, I'll feel like I succeeded. And since then, I've had over 220 in Hebrew and in English in 5 different countries. And what I've seen in people's eyes is that when you invite them to a conversation about Israel, that's not about Bibi and not about BDS and not about Palestinians, but is about identity, about culture, about ideology, they're thrilled. So I think we're doing a terrible job. As I said, I think in the Jewish day schools and in Israel education, we focus on the politicians and on the generals and on the wars. And more than that, we're not focusing on the poetry. We're not focusing on the ideology. We need to open up the conversation in a way that really gets people thinking, not just about the dilemmas we were talking about, but the ideas. And I like one of the phrases that Nachman used of nation building. Right? That this is really an experiment. And Rachel was bringing this a sense of the millennial opportunity this is. And that's missing, because when we start with Israel the wars, and Israel the Palestinian conflict, and Israel the headaches, the excitement is lost, the excitement is gone. And when we start instead with the amazing, extraordinary opportunities here and this extraordinary story of ours, then we're in a whole different space. So the leaders are in some ways vehicles for us, tools for us to get to those core values and those core ideals. And that's what people really need to hear.
Jonathan's asking about Israeli education.
Yep.
He wants to know in Israeli schools, how are they teaching about leadership? I'm curious as well, because as we all know, the models that are put on these pedestals, right? I mean, look at what's happening in America right now. We're renaming Woodrow Wilson. We're tearing down the statues, right? There's a re-examination happening. So I'm curious what's going on in terms of the Israeli education.
When I was jogging this morning, I just thought about that, Rachel. I said to myself, why are we not ready to face the Nakba in our history, the 1948 story? Maybe it's time to open that file as well, as you are doing now in the United States. Maybe you do it because 400 years have passed, but you know exactly where we are. It's not only 400 years, it's what's going on now. It applies to Israel as well. Israel is not ready for that, unfortunately. It's not ready. The Israeli education system is much more conservative than you expect. It's not open, Gil. It's not open. It's not liberal. And what the Israeli educators like to do most is to teach about the 15th and 16th century and not about the 20th century. You said Altalena. There's no agreed version what happened in Altalena, Rachel. Not yet. Everyone will come with his own story. It depends very much on the education minister at the time. If he's from the right or if he's from the left. No, not much left from the left, so it's usually from the center or from the right. They prefer to teach about Jewish history, which the students don't like very much, than to teach about Israel today, the contemporary history, what we are doing in Israel. And when I taught a little bit at Israel universities years ago, I was shocked to see how little they know about Israel history, how much they know about the Yom Kippur War, and about Levi Eshkol, if you want, about other chapters of Israel history, because they are still controversial. Everyone comes up with his own version and with his own history. We are not ready for that yet. So, unfortunately, we are not going to discuss the Nakba. I'm not the one who's going now to assume responsibility for the Nakba, not at all, I'm not there, but I'd like to discuss it publicly. The very fact that we passed the legislation in the Knesset, not me myself, I voted against, barring certain civil or human rights organizations or other non-governmental organizations to enter schools and to run discussions with high school students, not with elementary, with high school students about issues that are controversial, like B'Tselem or Shovrim Shtika or others, that I totally disagree with them. But I still, that 16 or 15 years old guys, young students are able to discuss that. And nothing will happen to them. They'll still go to the army and serve in the army and do their best to defend the state of Israel. But they should be open-minded and to hear different opinions and different points of views. So I feel that we are doing something the wrong way. We're taking the education the wrong way. My 12 years old granddaughter now goes to Nase Herzliya. I follow her to see what will she learn about Israel history now. I don't say a word, but I'm just checking her books and figure out what is she going through to figure out how much she will learn about what happened in her own country 10, 20, or 50 years ago. That will be my personal lesson.
As someone who 2 days from now is finally going to graduate from the Israeli school system, because my 18-year-old daughter is just about to graduate from Yud Bet, I agree with you that the history education here is quite superficial. They teach to the Bagrut, the matriculation exam, in a sort of mi amar lemi sort of way, so the kids will learn one line about Levi Eshkol, one line about Ben-Gurion, nothing about the dilemmas, nothing about the rich dimensionality of the decision-making they had to make, nothing about the ideas behind Zionism, and that's lacking. I will say two positive things. One, and I think there's a certain pride and constructive sense of civics, which we certainly feel around Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, that looks at history not just through our flaws and not just through our shortcomings, but also through our strengths and through our successes and through our ideals that help make us better, that is missing right now in the current conversation in the United States of America. And I have to say that despite overall feeling like, yes, there's a narrowness in Israeli education, I know that my kids at various moments, partially because they had an extraordinary mechanech educator here, or because of the particular school they were in, did have some meetings with fellow citizens, Israeli Arabs, or with Armenians here in Jerusalem. And there are some pockets of light, but there's a lot of more work to be done. And part of the problem is, frankly, that we have education ministers who aren't professionals, but are often partisan hacks. And it's roll of the dice. Sometimes they're good and they care, and sometimes they're not, and it's just a place to fill in. And that's a serious fundamental problem.
All right, we have one more question that just came in from Merrill from Philadelphia. Nachman's description of the tensions or lack of discussion about the controversial in Israel's history and society, this is more of a comment, I'm sorry, reminds me of the discussions that are had with some community stakeholders who do not want Israel education in the United States to include gray and messy discussions. You guys have used leaders as a great example of how we can teach some of the gray and muddled discussions. I think it's a great comment, Merrill, and I agree. It's very similar to some of the public conversations that we're having. How do we engage in these gray and messy conversations in a way that pushes forward Israel education, pushes forward the concept of leadership? I think is something that we all struggle with, and that's a really important thing.